So, now we come to last, but oh, certainly not least. We come to Gate. Now, I have to whip out my notes for this because specifically, I was requested to watch episode 17 of the anime Gate. If you need to know one thing about Obsidia and her view on anime, is that Obsidia fucking hates Gate. Well, I wish I could be apathetic towards Gate, but I can't because it angers me on such fundamental levels all across the board. And in context, I watched the first 12 episodes of Gate prior to the request for me to watch episode 17 specifically. Here we go. So I'm going to do episode 17, and then I'm going to lead it into why Gate as a series as a whole is so problematic and so terrible. So episode 17 of Gate deals with our main character, who is the most ridiculous, like, somehow special forces of everything, lazy otaku Japanese officer. And his group of waifu has to team up with some dark elves who had their like village attacked by this big dragon, which has been a reoccurring threat throughout the first half of the season. So he comes up with this plan to basically give the dark elves like RPGs, basically like these anti-tank missile launcher things. And this is a reoccurring issue with Gate as a whole, but there is always this near fetishistic obsession with military hardware in Gate. Like, it's almost like Gate spends more time focusing on the various military hardware that they're using than they do on the gratuitous fan service, which they're also using, to really show you where the priorities of the show are at. So they spend lots of time, almost luridly going over these different weapons and different modern hardware given to these dark elves. And then they eventually set up like an enormous yeah, I know, it's the author's fetish. I know. I'm gonna get into the author. I will get into the author. So eventually he sets up like 150 kilos of C4 in this dragon's den, and the dragon shows up and proceeds to murder a lot of the dark elves, and they ignore all the advice he told them, and then he blows up the dragon by detonating the C4. So the dragon dies. And you're like, okay, I guess, all right. The RPGs ultimately ended up being fairly pointless in this because the C4 was what literally does everything, but that is what it is. So now we come to them fleeing from the site of the destroyed dragon, and they go back to the surface, and we encounter Rory Mercury, who is a character I'm going to go into much more detail about in my reasons why I hate Gate as a show. But Rory Mercury, in context, is a super powerful, horny, murder lolly god of death. And she is so incredibly powerful, but they encounter her super fucked up back on the surface, and they're like, oh no, what happened? And apparently what happened was she made like a pact with the main character that she would absorb his wounds. So when he got hit by like the backblast of one of these RPGs, she got it instead. And this led to another horny lolly murder god, Dragon Girl, showing up and beating her up because she's like, aha, she's finally weak enough. Ah ha ha ha, you fools. And she goes, it was I who awakened the dragon to murder all of these people because I needed it to wake up so it could pump out some eggs for me so I could have my own dragons. These 2 dragons I will show off to come kill you. You guys are so pathetic, I do not need to kill you myself. I instead will send dragons after you. And so then So then the main character and his crew of waifus are fleeing away from the lolly and her dragons, and the dragons are very poorly CGI'd. Very poorly CGI'd. And they're chasing after them, and they're like about to summon their fire to like burn the characters. But they spend about to summon their fire for, I'm gonna say, like 30 seconds of screen time. So a very long swath of screen time. And you know what happens then? You know how they defeat the dragons? You know how they defeat the lolly? Is it the main character's actions? Is it the actions of his assembled waifu over the course of this anime? No. It's Deus Ex Military. Because for some reason that has not been like explained at all or even established in any part of the episode, the Japanese just happened to have 2 fighter jets nearby who proceed to fire like a single missile each, which kills each one of the dragons immediately. And then a whole bunch of self-propelled artillery platforms start unloading artillery shells into the dragons and around the lolly for unknown reasons, as well as a bunch of Japanese soldiers come running up, and the lolly flees this level of destruction. And that's the fucking episode. That is the episode of 17 of Gate. And so now we're gonna go into why I hate Gate as a whole. So I fucking hate Gate. I think Gate is one of the worst things that I've seen as an anime. So here's the problem with Gate. Gate is an isekai in almost one of the cringiest power fantasies I've ever seen, because the power fantasy is for the Japanese military as a whole. And so the premise of the show is that a portal opens up one day in Japan, and monsters and like fantasy people come into this world and start just killing like random Japanese people on the street. And so as they're massacring people, this main character, who's this lazy otaku, which has this reoccurring meme of he has somehow done every form of special forces training in existence and is the world's most greatest elitist soldiers, despite being a second lieutenant and a lazy otaku, flees from these and able to rally, and then the Japanese self-defense force shows up and kills all the fantasy people, and then launches a counterattack through the portal into the fantasy world. Now, here's one of the main problems with Gate. Gate, at the best of times, is mind-numbingly boring. And the reason why it's boring is much like I described the way Overlord was boring. Because it has no real stakes. Japanese people do not die in this show. Japanese people sometimes get a little injured in it, but it is set up that the Japanese military is so leaps and bounds more powerful than this fantasy world that they can massacre with impunity everything the world can throw at them. And it's almost laughable how much they massacre them. And so it is given, rather than trying to explore like a fantasy world versus a modern military, it is rather showing, look how fucking laughable it is that a fantasy world's like magic and swords could ever compete with my trusty assault rifle and machine gun. And so it just becomes this almost like bully use of military force against people who cannot possibly defend themselves from it. And that continues the entire series. So the main character, is this doofus of a man, who's somehow the greatest person ever, ends up basically hooking up with waifus from all across the fantasy world who are all obsessed with him. And he meets Rory Mercury. Now, the problem with Rory Mercury is, as a character, she's fine. She's a fine character. She's got a cute design. She's a horny murder lolly god. But she is the reason why the show fundamentally does not work as a series. Because the Japanese military is so much stronger than everything that's put against them, and she is literally a god who can defeat entire armies by herself. And if she had been used against the Japanese military, they could have actually had a serious threat, potentially. But she's not. She immediately joins up with the Japanese to further create the learning curve of destruction that they have against this world. And so that anything that a normal gun or missile or whatever could not harm, Rory Mercury can single-handedly defeat on her own. Therefore, there are zero stakes in the show. There is zero risk to the characters. Anytime they're in a fight, it doesn't matter. Guns or Rory Mercury can stop it. And so you don't care about any fight that happens. The only reason why you like the fights that happen in Gate is because you want to see gratuitous military hardware being used against random people and monsters. And so, like, the most iconic fight that everyone talks about being so good is a fight that ends up being basically a shot-for-shot recreation of the helicopter assault landings from Apocalypse Now. And, like, as an artist, I can appreciate that. However, it was done on the cusp of, like, these, 6 Japanese characters who only one of them actually has any real personality to them, fighting, a bandit army with some locals, and then these helicopters show up and just massacre everyone. And that's how it's solved. And so it just leads to this incredibly boring format of, like, it's entirely squandering the premise that they were given. You could have had a really interesting clash between modern technological prowess and magic of a fantasy world and monsters. But instead, they end up just giving magic and all the capabilities of gods to the Japanese, so it just becomes kind of just a roving crush fest of them versus everything they do. And everyone else in the world just kind of like, okay, well, we're going to try and stop them even though we got nothing, or we're going to keep trying to stop each other, and then the Japanese get involved. So, like, at the base level, I think it's very boring. Now we're going to talk about why it's really, really, really fucking problematic as a show specifically by the Japanese. Now, it is very clear the show is Japanese military propaganda at its core. The author of the series was, he did his time with the Japanese Self-Defense Force, and he was really mad that more people didn't like the Japanese military in Japan. So he created this fan fiction where the Japanese military are such good guys and are so good and so awesome that nobody can stop them. And they can go crush all of the bad guys, quote unquote, of this less developed world. And they're also so humanitarian and altruistic and stuff. Isn't that great? Seeing how much the Japanese are so fucking awesome and the military is so fucking awesome. And so the problem with this, for one, is, in case you were unaware, the Japanese military has a bit of a bad reputation that it very, very earnestly earned because of its actions in World War II. It so colossally fucked up as a military that they were not allowed to have a military for a while on account of all the genocide and mass murder. Now, when you have Japan poised as a literal technological and societal superior to less developed fantasy people, there are obviously clear parallels to a Japanese colonial relationship with East Asia. And you can see why that may have problematic undertones when you're talking about Japanese militarism and colonialism in a world. Especially where the people of that world are literally backwards barbarians compared to the Japanese, which was a common portrayal by the Japanese and their military and their racial outlook towards the rest of East Asia. Now, you could see why that would be problematic unto itself. Also, the fact that the Japanese have this portal that they won't allow the rest of the international community access to, where, mind you, the United States is viewed as the bad guy in this setting, also kind of cringy. because they don't trust. They do not trust the rest of the world getting a hold of these fantasy people and their resources. They need Japanese military paternalism to be able to safeguard these poor, ignorant, helpless fantasy people. Now, furthermore, now we're gonna talk about waifu, and why waifu is really problematic in this setting. So, when you have, as I previously framed it, the Japanese military and its poor track record of relations with other cultures, there also is very problematic when the Japanese are intervening into this fantasy world where they're taking women from that fantasy world who are just naturally drawn to the Japanese, and specifically a masculine Japanese military man, to think of them as just so great and such wonderful protectors and such great stewards of them. Because, as you are aware, this also comes with the issue of all of the good people in the show are fantasy girls, all the bad people are fantasy boys. And this is very much like the men of this world are the problem and the women are good once they're given access to a good Japanese soldier, which is obviously incredibly problematic when you make them very horny, because it has clear homages to the Japanese comfort women system prior to and during World War II. So this literally makes basically a form of acceptable comfort women. And it's also problematic when you've got a fucking horny lolly as a part of that, because it adds children's aspects to that. So you have this very, very sexist, racist portrayal of Japanese militarism that is entirely unchecked. They are undefeated in every encounter they make. The world would be better in this fantasy setting if they were to trust themselves to their superior Japanese masters who know better. And so you can see why that is also incredibly problematic for this anime to portray. And so these are the reasons why I hate Gate. As a just baseline artistic property, it is boring. As a isekai, it entirely squanders its premise to be able to just do military pornography of showing all this awesome military equipment mass murdering the people and creatures of this world. And as a cultural and historical piece in the context of Japan and its creator, it's military propaganda that is also basically taking the worst traits of Japanese history and repainting them and reframing them in a positive light to show how charming they would be if only the rest of the world would let them and allow them to their own devices. So this is why I hate Gate. This is why I will always talk about how much I hate Gate. This is why I will always rant about Gate. And this is why I say, you are allowed to like Gate, but I hope that you hear my words and you come to the conclusion that maybe I should reconsider how much I like Gate, because it is so profoundly bad and, at worst, absolutely fucked up. So, there you go. That is the Gate rant. That is episode 17. And tossing my notes away once more. That is my anime reviews. That is Gate.